like to welcome everybody. This is our fourth event in our Women in Tibetan Studies lecture series this spring that the Modern Tibetan Studies program has been hosting. And we're very pleased today to welcome Diana Lange, who is a visiting professor for Tibetology at the Institute for Asian and African Studies at Humboldt University in Berlin. She's also the principal investigator of the project Maps as Knowledge Resources and Map Making as Process, the case of the mapping of Tibet for the Cluster of Excellence on Understanding Written Artifacts at the University of Hamburg. Previously, she has served as a postdoc fellow at the University of Leipzig, a visiting lecturer at the University of Zurich, and as an associated researcher in the European Research Council project TIB Army at the CNRS in Paris. Professor Lange is trained in sinology, Central Asian studies, and economics. She holds a PhD in Central Asian studies from Humboldt University of Berlin and specializes on Tibet and Himalayas, as well as East Asia. Her research interests include the history of knowledge and exploration, material and visual cultures, history of mapping and cartography and cultural interactions. Her work on the British Library's WISE collection, which is a collection of 55 large format maps and drawings by a Tibetan Lama in the mid-19th century, can be found in her monograph, An Atlas of the Himalayas by a 19th century Tibetan Lama, a journey of discovery that's published by Brill in 2020. And her dissertation has been published in German and was the basis for a 2014 article that is published in the Tibet Journal. Her English article is "The Government Forced Us to Send the Boat in the Middle of the Water Transport in Pre-1959 Tibet." We are especially honored to have you here. And we wanted to, the purpose of the series is to honor women who are doing interesting work, who are breaking new ground in the field, who've made a serious contribution in Tibetan studies. And we also were able to benefit from your workshop yesterday on maps, which was fascinating. People really enjoyed that. And just wanted to acknowledge that, the work you're doing on material culture and mapping and how important that's been for us to engage with you during your visit here. I think I will pause there. I'd like to thank the Weatherhead East Asian Institute for providing the funds to host this talk today. And I think with no further ado, okay, let's start your program.
Yeah, thank you very much for this nice introduction. It is really my great pleasure to give a talk on the significance of waterways in pre-1959 Tibet. I must say that I haven't touched this topic for quite some years now because my research in the past years was focused on other topics. But during the preparation of this talk, I realized that this topic didn't lose anything of its significance. So I came in contact with this topic for the first time during my PhD project, in which I documented and analyzed the economics, the techniques, and socio-cultural dimensions of Tibetan fishing communities in Southern and Central Tibet. And in this context, I investigated how fishermen adapted to the geographical, ecological, and cultural conditions of their environment and how they utilized the potential of their environment for their own economy. So in the very beginning of this PhD project, I was most interested in the question, how can a Tibetan be a Buddhist and a professional sinner, a fisherman at the same time? So my two main research questions were, first, how have the fishermen adapted to the changes in the last decades in relation to new infrastructure, to ecology, to new technologies, to new politics and society? And two, in what way can material culture be used as an indicator for these transformations in the social, cultural, and economic fields? And the last remaining fishing village in central Tibet, south of Lhasa, provided the opportunity for a detailed case study, and the Yakhide-Boat was exemplary for my analysis of the fisherman's material culture. So I have conducted fieldwork in central Tibet several times in the past between 2003 and 2012, namely 2003, 4, 9, and 12. How can I remove this? Yeah, good. So since many fishermen of the older generation had also worked as ferrymen in the past before 59, I came in contact with the subject of waterways and water transport on many occasions and from different perspectives during my fieldwork. So these impressions inspired me to pursue research on the traditional water transport system in pre-1959 Tibet as a postdoc project after I finished this dissertation. And the aim of today's talk is not only to share my research results that are all already published, but also to provide some insights in my future research plans dealing with waterways on the Tibetan Plateau and in Central Asia. So, should move to the next slide. We'll drag the page up and down. No. Okay, so I do. Now let's check. Yeah, now it works. Okay, good. Let's start with the significance of fishery in Tibet. In general, it can be stated that the basic natural and cultural conditions for fishing in Tibet vary greatly. So while the natural landscape of the Tibetan Plateau offers high potential for fishery, the cultural conditions tend to contradict the exploitation of that resource, namely the attitude of many Tibetans towards fish as food and the position of the Tibetan fishermen in Tibetan society. So fishery in Tibet has generally been limited by the lack of a real fishing and fish eating tradition among local populations for different reasons. On the one hand, there exist many prejudices against fish as food in Tibet, and popular accounts still maintain the myth that Tibetans don't eat fish at all. On the other hand, fish is regarded as a very good medicine for several diseases. For example, dried fish is said to be an excellent drug for pregnant women, and fish from holy lakes are said to be of a very special quality. The pre-modern central Tibetan state social and religious criteria were used to define social ranking, and next to, for example, butchers, fishermen belong to the lowest level of the organizational society and as occupational groups who benefited directly from the death of living beings, so professional sinners. So fishermen who killed fish and lived at the coast of their lives were regarded as polluted with no hope of a higher rebirth. So nobody actually wanted to become a fisherman. And social contact with those groups who were professional sinners were generally avoided. So these social sanctions against fishermen and the attitude of the Tibetans towards fish as a food had a hindering effect to the development of a real fishery tradition. Whose fishery can be described as an economic niche in the Tibetan economic system. And only few Tibetans ever depended predominantly upon fishing for their livelihoods, and a fishing culture, a so-called fishing culture, developed only at places in central and southern Tibet where the local residents depended on that source of income or food due to geographical circumstances such as for example, the lack of fertile land. Usually, fishing activities stopped as soon as enough fertile land was available for subsistence economy. So the region of the northern and western shore of the Yakhide-Boat Lake was one of the regions where fishery in the past played an important role for the local economy. And since many foreign travelers, mainly European travelers, crossed the lake on their way to Lhasa, fishery was more or less well documented, or at least mentioned in their reports by most of them. And that's why I started my field work in 2003 in this region. And I have still the very little encouraging words of my supervisor, Tony Huber, in mind, who said, maybe you will find nothing. However, I found out that fishing activities in that area were stopped in the 1930s and 1940s due to restrictions of the central government, and only a few traces are left. For example, there are some ruins of former buildings that were used to dry fish in that region that still exist. And I met some very old former fishermen who shared their knowledge about the fishing traditions in that region with me. And one of them even did show me, as you can see, one of the old nets they used for fishing until the 1940s. However, I was also lucky since it was at the Yakhide-Boat Lake where I heard about the only remaining community where the inhabitants still live as fishermen in central Tibet, the village of June, situated on the east bank of the southern part of the Chushur River and belonging to Chushur County. So you can see I marked June with a red dot. I'm not sure if you can see it here, but this is where the village is located. So while the village of June in the west borders directly on the Chushur River, mountains surround it to the south and east. So June is actually located here on the other side of the river. So the location of June, and I have to go back, can actually be compared with that of an island. Until 2004, it was only possible to reach the place with Yakhide-Boats. So when I arrived at that place for the first time in 2003, it was quite frustrating to standing there on the river and not being able to cross the river. So I had to make an appointment with people from June who I found in a little restaurant in Chushur, and who promised to pick me up the next day with their Yakhide-Boat. This is what you can see on the lower left side. And that was the first time I went there. So this is how the village looked like. So June's proximity to the river Chushur was only one reason for the development of a fishing tradition there, a shortage of arable land being the other. So there was just not enough fertile land for a subsistence economy in that area. And due to these circumstances, the people of June have long depended significantly upon fishing. Until 1959, they lived largely by providing ferry transport services on both on the Chushur River, but also in the Yakhide-Boat River. And they also paid their taxes in the form of these services. In 2003, and this is a picture I took in 2003, 400 people, around 80 families lived in June, and their economic life was based upon a mix of fishery, agriculture, seasonal pastoralism, and handicrafts. And at that time, the Yakhide-Boat played a major role for the villagers, for fishing and for transport. The June's economic fortunes have improved greatly with the influx of Chinese migrants to the Lhasa area, with the result that local subsistence fishing has developed into a commercial enterprise since the 1980s. So in this context, the 1980s really marked the beginning of an improvement of their economic conditions due to three main factors. First, the strong increase of Chinese demand for fish. Chinese usually love to eat fish in contrast to Tibetans. The improvement of fishing technology and changes in work relations, meaning the beginning of working for Chinese middlemen. So the increased demand for fish could only be satisfied by using modern nets. Prior to 1959, fish were usually caught using drag nets in summer and with spears through holes in the ice during the winter. And today, gill netting is the main method used. The introduction of gill nets had consequences for the division of labor. So while using the old nets that you can see here in the upper part, 6 people and 2 boats were necessary for fishing. 2 people were responsible for the rowing of the boats, with 2 people for the upper and 2 for the lower part of the net. And using gill nets, there were only 2 people required for fishing, one rowing the boat and the other using the nets. In the 1980s, the rivers still had an abundance of fish, and thus the price for fish was rather low in Lhasa. The price of fish has quite a wide seasonal fluctuation, with spring fish very popular and therefore very expensive, and autumn fish comparably cheap. So during the late 1980s, the Tibetan fishermen began working to order for Chinese bosses. And these organizational changes had consequences for the division of labor, for the relations and organization between the fishermen themselves, and for the marketing of the catch. Before, the fishermen sold their fish themselves in nearby Nyemo, in Lhasa, and in various villages. And later, the catch was generally collected by the middlemen at different places and paid immediately, and later sold to fish markets in Lhasa or exported to mainland China. And here you can see how the fish was measured and then transported in plastic bags, where additional oxygen was added, and then they were put to Lhasa or transported to Lhasa. And for the fishermen, they regarded the delivery of living fish to middlemen as the most comfortable way of conducting the fish trade, because this way they avoid the act of killing the fish. The fish that are caught for subsistence have to be killed, of course, but that normally happens in a kind of passive manner. The fish suffocate on the bottom of the boats or later on the cross, where they are spread after being caught. And by delivering the still living fish to other people, the Tibetan fishermen avoid the direct act of killing. And it was quite a strange feeling to join them on the boat, catching fish, and to see that they didn't kill the fish, but put them on the bottom of the boat and let them, well, die, suffocate. Most of the fishermen stopped fishing at an age of around 55 to 60 years, like this gentleman that I interviewed in June, and intensively engaged in religious practices in order to try to compensate for their sins. This pattern is also usual in other occupation groups who take lives, such as hunters and soldiers. So Tony Huber, who worked extensively on hunting tradition, hunting culture in Tibet, he experienced similar examples. So the seasonal organization of the tune fishery is strongly connected with seasonal temperature variation. So while in summer and autumn fishing activities take place mostly in nearby regions around Lhasa, around Chushur, the cold temperature in winter offers the chance to go fishing further away and transport the fish back fresh to Lhasa. I'm talking about trips to Ngari, covering more than 200-300 kilometers. So as a result of the rising demand for fish, rivers are becoming gradually overfished. The problem is in Tibet is that due to the lower level of oxygen, the fish do not grow that fast, and they do not recover that fast as in other parts of the world. Another reason for the decrease of the fish population in the Chushur and Yolong-Tsangpo rivers is definitely the increasing level of pollution entering these rivers, although there's not much industry in that region compared to other regions in mainland China. The wastewater from Lhasa city is polluting both rivers, and of course the climate change had an effect on the water level of the rivers, as you can see here of extracts of the Chushur River in the Lhasa area. So to satisfy the demand for fish, other alternatives have to be found by the fishermen. And for the fishermen of Chun, this means widening the radius of their fishing activities up to Ngari, for example, as already mentioned before. The most significant recent changes in Chun were introduced by the construction of the shortcut road between Lhasa and Gunga Airport, with 2 new bridges crossing the Chushur and the Yolong-Tsangpo, and 1 tunnel in between. So Lhasa's up there. Here's Chun. Here's 1 bridge. This is a tunnel, other bridge, and Gunga Airport is somewhere here. Within this context, or with the context of this infrastructure project, the village was connected to the local network, and the former island location is now a thing of the past. And I was really very lucky because I found the village before or I was able to visit the village before and after this construction of the road. So this road was actually just built between 2003 and 2004. And this is how it looked like in 2003. And this was 1 year later. So in 2003, I was climbing along these rocks to get to the village. And this is how it looked like 1 year later. And I remember when they told me in the village in 2003 that there's an idea of constructing a road, I thought it would take ages. And when I called them in 2004, when I came back and asked them to collect me, I was really absolutely surprised that they were not waiting for me with the boats, but with one of these little blue tuk-tuk cars. So the consequences of this road for the village are various. First of all, the boats lost their transport function and were replaced by motorized vehicles, as you can see on this slide. And the construction of the new tunnel also produced a byproduct, stone. And since the land on the shore of the Chushur, where the tunnel was built, belonged to Chun, the inhabitants were allowed to collect stone there for free. And this offered a real new source of income as a real alternative to fishing, selling stone, and using stone for building new houses. So there was a kind of building boom everywhere in the area in the early 2000s. So everybody wanted to construct new houses like this one. And so the old houses were replaced by new stone houses. So this infrastructural improvement was only the first step on the way to a decreasing dependency on fishery, and it was maybe also the first step on the way to stop fishing entirely. The new road also offered the people of Chun a completely other source of income. Outsiders such as Chinese tourists now find it relatively easy to reach there by road, as you can see. Junpa Fishing Village, there's even a road sign on the street. So the unique status of Chun as the only Tibetan fishing village has made the place extremely popular. And several articles have been recently published about Chun's boat building tradition, fishing tradition, as this one in a Chinese magazine. So the success of Chun as a tourist destination led even to the establishment of a fish restaurant between the village and the main road. In the beginning, it was just meant to offer fish for tourists and local Chinese officials who are fond of the different fish dishes. Like this is how it started in 2004. And in 2012, they started creating a much bigger fishing village with nice pavilions along the river and so on. I don't know how it looks nowadays. Encouraged by NGOs, most of them from the US and from Lhasa, the villagers started producing mainly leather products such as bags, as you can see here. And some of them, and that was in particular of particular interest for me, started building model boats for the growing tourist market in Lhasa, a product that is unique to this fishing village. And although these model boats are only built as souvenirs, they are reproduced with all necessary equipment, such as oars and carrying straps. So the original being copied as closely as possible. Although I must say they don't use Yakhide to produce the little boats, it's just too thick, they use sheep's. And these boats can be purchased in several shops in Lhasa, such as those in the Tibet Museum, the Nobelinka, or in small local handicraft shops around the Barco area. So the question is, are these little boats the end or the future of the original Yakhide boats? Can these little boats be used as an indicator for the changes June was confronted with in the last decades? This is one of the reasons why I decided to use the shrinking of the Yakhide boats as title for my PhD publication. So until the beginning of the 20th century, Yakhide boats played an important role in Tibetan water transportation systems. Due to road and bridge construction June was linked, as mentioned before, to the local network in 2004, and the Yakhide boats are about to be transformed, as well as the profession of the fishermen, both remaining probably only in the form of small model boats made for tourists. So Yakhide boats fit perfectly with their environment. They were not only built with local materials such as Yakhide, yakwool, and wood, but they are also light enough to be carried upon the boatman's back. So the mobility was a necessarily aspect of their design, because they cannot be navigated upstream in or on Tibetan rivers. And in the course of the increasing development of infrastructure and the connection of the village to the road network by bridges, the former ferry and transport function of the Yakhide boats became increasingly redundant, and their number is now decreasing dramatically. Construction method of the boats did not change, but the way they were used did. While in former times the boat had to be carried by men on their back, nowadays it is possible to transport the boats on cars. Marches of miles carrying the boats belong to the memories of the past. And since I became in contact with the subject of waterways on many occasions during my PhD, a postdoc project on this issue was actually kind of logic consequence. So I realized that the study of water transport as part of the transport system of pre-1959 Tibet has generally been neglected so far. Boats and ferries are usually considered just as means of crossing rivers, but their role in transporting goods and people along the rivers has been overlooked so far. Nevertheless, the study of water transport in Tibet is of wider cross-disciplinary significance, because it demonstrates how water transport has been linked over time to economic, political, infrastructural, technological, and socio-cultural ideas. The transport system that existed in pre-1959 Tibet was a combination of water transport and a road system. It was heavily influenced by the natural environment and climate of the Tibetan plateau, and adapted to these natural conditions of life. And along with caravan routes, waterways had a really important function in local and long distance transport. The availability of water transport and Tibet's mountainous characters are two of the main reasons why it was so deficient in roads and why waterways were important arteries of transportation. So overland transport for the movement of people and goods relied almost entirely on animal power, and of the sheep and donkeys, yaks were the main animals used to transport goods in Tibet. The problem was that the character of important rivers in Tibet made it quite difficult to construct bridges. They are just quite wide, most of the rivers. So before 1959, there were only few bridges in Tibet. Even the iron chain bridges of Chaksam and Nyango spanned only a single stream or single streams of the Yalung almost entirely, almost everything that moved, including animals, went at least partly by water. There are no historical accounts concerning the first use of watercraft on the Tibetan plateau. Images of boats appear on several murals in monasteries and private houses, such as Potala, for example, but there's no exact data about the time of origin, although the fifth Dalai Lama mentioned in his autobiography that the Tibetans did not have wooden ferries before the 13th century. So Yakhide-boats and wooden ferries, wooden horsehead ferries, were an essential part of the transport system. Many early European travelers to Tibet described watercraft as primitive or as of the crudest construction. Sarachandra Das, famous pundit, said of the Yakhide boats, indeed, Tibetans seem perfectly ignorant of the art of boat making. In spite of the lack of enthusiasm expressed by Western travelers for the Yakhide boats, they can be regarded as an expression of Tibetan technological ingenuity. They were perfectly adapted to the natural environment in terms of their use and available materials. So for me, these boats are just perfect. So in the context of fishery, and by analyzing their construction technology, and I documented the boat building process that took 3 days in 2003. We can also explain the relationship that Tibetans have to their environment and reveal a real richness and cultural motives and symbolism. So the majority of boats in central and southern Tibet were made of animal skins, and the wooden boats were only used in a few places, such as Chaksam. Due to the rapid currents of most Tibetan rivers, it was not possible to navigate non-motorized boats upstream after ferrying goods and people downstream. That means that the boats had to be transported back to their starting point by land, and therefore had to be light enough to be able to be carried on man's back. A lightweight was thus a necessary aspect of their design. And the Tibetans used the local available materials, skins, and limited amounts of food to create suitable boats for these conditions. That's why these boats are just perfectly adapted to the environment and the needs. Tibetan boatmen use different terms for their boats depending on their size and use. The common term for boat in Tibetan is dru. Kodru means hide boat. Another popular word is koa. The term ko means leather, so koa is actually a boat made of hide. Boats were also boats that were made from 4 yak hides were called 4 hides boats or chichu. The Tibetan term juk is commonly used to name the offspring of an animal. So the smaller boats made of 3 hides were called horn boats or kojuk. The trapeze-shaped form makes the hide boats not only easier to navigate, but also offers a higher carrying capacity. The significant transport function of these watercrafts, particularly their use on the most important travel routes between Lhasa and Sedang in central Tibet, certainly supported this development. For example, the use of water transport was essential in the context of the construction of the Potala Palace in the 17th century. About 300 hide boats are said to have been used to carry the stone and wooden rafts that were used to construct the Potala. Even whole stone pillars were transported to Lhasa by boat. Tangtung Kyalpo is regarded as the inventor of Tibetan boats and ferries. Every hide boat has a special piece of skin in the shape of a little triangle in the middle of the longer port side, here and here, called the head of Tangtung Kyalpo, which is believed to protect the boat against unlucky accidents and, of course, Lu. Tangtung Kyalpo is also credited with the building of iron and chain bridges, and images of him usually show him holding a piece of an iron chain in his hand, as you can see here and here. The wooden ferries were decorated with carved horse heads and prayer flags on the prows. Here you can hopefully see the horse head. Compared to the light hide boats, the wooden ferries were relatively big and difficult to navigate. To provide greater stability, these ferries had iron decorations on the sides and edges, and there were 2 oars on each side of the ferry prow. These were to row the vessel and were handled by several persons. The 5th oar was positioned in the middle of the vessel's stern and was used for navigation. It was handled by 1 person who commanded the vessel. Finally, there were doors on both sides. The Horsehead ferries were built on the riverbanks of the Yolong-Tsangpo at 2 places, at the Chaksam ferry station and in Sedang. They were constructed with wood, mainly walnut, from eastern and southern Tibet. And once ready, they were pulled to their place of destination by men walking along the riverbank. The last Horsehead ferries were built in the 1940s, and today no example survived. I only found 1 little model boat in the Tibet Museum in Lhasa that was built by one of the people working in the museum, by a Tibetan scholar who did some research on the history of boats in Tibet. He had also the chance to do some interviews with very old men who were engaged in the boat, the ferry building construction in the 1940s. But I didn't have a chance to meet these people. I was just too young for this. The Horsehead ferries, they were replaced starting from the 1950s by square-shaped Chinese motorized wooden vessels that are still in use at some places in central Tibet, like these ferries that are used if you want to go to Samye, crossing the Yolong-Tsangpo. So the transport system in general and the water transport system in particular were geared to the needs of the Tibetan state and monastic system, and even remote monasteries, which were only easily accessible by river, were integrated into this system. So during my last fieldwork in 2012, I traveled along these rivers and tried to find out as much as possible, or all still remaining traces of the former ferry stations. For instance, on the route between the Chaksam and the Nyangko ferry stations in the east of Sedang, along a distance of around 120 kilometers, there existed 6 ferry stations, all of which served the monasteries of the northern shore of the Yolong-Tsangpo, like Dorjichak and Samye. At least 2 of these were still in service in summer 2012 and were used mainly by pilgrims visiting these 2 main monasteries, Dorjichak and Samye. So ferry and transport services were integrated into the local and regional tax structure as so-called corvée services. The corvée system provided the framework for the Tibetan transport system as a whole and for the water transport system in particular, with the local population providing ferry services for people and goods as part of their tax liability. While the different names of the boats according to their size, mentioned before, so made of 3 heights or 4 heights, boats were also named differently depending on their use. The way in which boats were named gives us information about the economic scope of their uses. So the so-called governmental boat, or shumchu, was used for ferrying people or goods. It was a form of corvée tax on that part of the boatman. Travelers, pilgrims, and traders often spent many hours on the boats during their journeys, and the boat and ferrymen entertained their passengers during these journeys by singing. During my interviews with old fishermen and former ferrymen, the subject of old boat songs came up, and these men began remembering the old texts and melodies. One local song took up the practice of providing ferry services for the government in affairs, saying, to send the hide boat in the middle of the night is at the behest of the government. Next to these governmental boats, the Tibetans used the term profit boat or beko for the boats that frequently made good money. So the passengers paid their fares not only in cash, but also in means of food such as butter, samba, or tea. And the man I interviewed remembered it as a relatively cheap service. The boatmen and the owners of the boats made much more profit by transporting goods such as wool on behalf of businessmen and traders. In pre-1959 Tibet, the most important travel route by water was the one between the capital of Lhasa and Setang in the east, via the Chushur-Ferry and the Samye Monastery, altogether a route of around 170 kilometers. The journey then took a total of 2 days. So they started here in Lhasa, went down the Chushur River, and then traveled until Setang. There were 3 ferry stations or ports in on the Chushur River along the Chushur River in Lhasa in the past. The Ramagang Ferry, the Tsecholing Ferry, and the Latong Ferry, all of them shown on the Lhasa map of the Wise collection. The Tsecholing Ferry was only used for river crossing, and the other 2 stations were used for river crossing as well as long-distance water transport. So the boats usually started in Lhasa and traveled downstream for around 60 kilometers. And in Chushur, where the Chushur flows into the Yolngu-Tsangpo, the boats that were continuing to the east down the Yolngu-Tsangpo River were often bound together with ropes by means of 2 special wooden sections fixed to the sides of the boats. And such connected boats were called corvée. I was only able to find one historical photograph in a Chinese magazine of these boats used in the past. All kind of commodities were transported along this route, including wool, grain, and firewood. While some of these goods were intended for consumption at places such as the big monasteries along the way, others were part of a long-distance trade network. For example, sheep wool from northern Tibet was transported to Lhasa overland, loaded in boats, and transported on the water until Tanang near Setang, and later again carried overland further to the south on packing animals to northern India and Bhutan, for example. This is an image of the so-called wool harbor in Lhasa. So you cannot even see the boats. They are really absolutely covered with sheep wool. As already mentioned before, hide boats had to be carried upstream. There were 2 methods by which this return transport was made. In the case of boats used for government services, they were carried by local villagers and passed along from village to village along the river. When the boats were used for private transport, they were carried on the back of the boatman. When the terrain permitted, The boats could be carried across shortcuts over the mountains, and to motivate the sheep to follow their masters, they were fed with sampa. And the famous shortcut was to carry the boats from Samye to Lhasa over the mountains. And the boatman told me it was actually more difficult to go uphill because the boat was on your back and was putting you down. And although this practice of carrying boats on one's back sounds like a heavy task, most of my informants who worked as boatmen in the past remember that procedure as not too exhausting because they were quite young at that time and they really made good money with the ferry service. So it was okay for them. According to legend, after having had a fight with the boatman over the ferry price, the Tibetan said Rechungpa condemned the boatman with the words, "May your boat be swept away downstream, may it be carried on the back upstream." In fact, after being in the water, the hide boats were quite heavy. Only a dry boat weight is around 60 kg. So it needed to be dried out before being carried upstream. The Tibetans still use this natural tanning, drying the boats in the sun after using them and then putting them in the shadow to avoid cracking the leather nowadays. According to local history, it was also Rechungpa who influenced the weight of the boat with the curse, "May the soaked boat be heavier than a corpse. May the dry oars be heavier than gold." So for carrying the boats, the Tibetans developed a special technique. With the help of a carrying strap and 2 oars, the boat is balanced on the back. And carrying boats on one's back is still practiced today, even though on a much smaller scale than in the past. Depending on the season, the terrain, the distance, the goods to be transported, and the water level, Tibetans used either hide boats or wood ferries to cross and travel along waterways. So the wooden ferries were only used for river crossing at fixed ferry stations like Chaksam, Yango, and Patama, while they were only usable at low water levels. High boats were more flexible. They didn't depend on the water level and could be used throughout the year. A local song collected by Kerstin Krotman described that system. "I know the story at Tensatil. On the way to Tensatil, there's a river. At Big River, there's the Latong Ferry. Big River is crossed with the Black Hide Boat. The Little River is crossed with the Horsehead-Boat. The Little River refers to low level, and the Big River to a higher level. And the Black Hide Boat, the color black, refers to the fact that sometimes there are still some remaining black yak hairs on the hide that were not completely removed." So since 1959, due to the modernization of infrastructure, water transport has lost much of its former significance, and the old Horsehead wooden ferries have disappeared completely, and the number of Yakhide-boats has been shrinking, and modern bridges replace the former ferry service. Traces of the old ferry and transport system can still be found in present-day Tibet. So, for example, this is my favorite example, the colloquial Tibetan name of the longest bridge in the southeast of Lhasa. Those of you who maybe studied at the Tibet University, this is the bridge quite close on the way to London. This bridge, yes. Yeah, the colloquial name of this bridge in the southeast of Lhasa shows that the old ferry station name survived in local terminology. The so-called Kuru Bridge, Kuru Sambo, is built where the former Latong ferry station used to be. The term Kuru is used in Tibet for a wooden X-shaped cross put on the mouth of a calf to stop it from suckling. remembering the former ferrymen who lost their source of income, so their milk, due to bridge construction. The Tibetans named the bridge Humboldt, that is Guru. Visible traces of the old water transport are the ruins of the old ferry stations and iron chain bridges, the piles of stones decorated with Tibetan prayer flags, all a reminder of their former role. This is one example of the remaining ruins of the former Chushur ferry station, and also the Lange ferry station still, or the ruins of the former Lange ferry station still exist nowadays. And you can see in the background the bridge that replaced the older ferry station. So to conclude, I see water transport throughout Tibetan history as a complex process based on the connection between nature, technology, and society. As I have shown, waterways not only had an important function in the local and long-distance transport system in pre-1959 Tibet, but the ferry and transport services were essential for Tibetan's trade and economy. The water transport system was controlled by the Tibetan government and monastic system, and therefore served the goals and interests of these ruling elites. The transportation system in pre-1959 Tibet was primarily adapted to the natural conditions of the landscape and its fauna, and so was the tax system. The transport services were integrated into the local and regional tax system as corvée tax, in particular communities that did not have enough fertile land, such as due to geographical circumstances, had to pay the tax dues in terms of corvée service. The case of the fishing village of June demonstrates how the tax payment was adapted to the community's economic and environmental conditions, its geographical location at the junction of the Yolong-Tsangpo River and the Kichu, and its relative proximity to the Chushur Ferry, to Lhasa and Setang, led to an inclusion of the villagers in the ferry and transport service as corvée tax. The village's boat building and fishing tradition provided the essential equipment in terms of boats, as well as technical skills and knowledge in terms of river navigation. Although the ferrymen belonged to the lowest level of the society and were regarded as dirty, Tibetan society essentially depended on their ferry and transport services. But waterways are much more than just a medium of transport of people, animals, and commodities using ferries and boats. They must be considered in a wider context. They are myths and beliefs enshrined in the oral history. There's a richness of cultural motives and symbolism in the watercraft, and there are special terms and songs used in relation to water transport. Different approaches should be combined to put all these fragments together and to produce a more nuanced picture of the importance of water transport in pre-1959 Tibet. And I'm of course aware of the fact that the water transport is just one part of the transport system in Tibet. A comprehensive history of transport in Tibet is long overdue and will be the focus of my future research. And also it's linked to the neighboring regions, to, for example, all these Assam stations that were also used in the transport system. So for those who are interested in reading more about this topic, I prepared a selected publication slides on publications on this topic. I think most of them you can find on my academia homepage, and the book is over there, dissertation in German. But yesterday I was told that Google Translator works, so even if you don't know German, you can read the book with Google Translator. So thank you very much for your attention, and now I'm